Hey everyone, and welcome back. We talk a lot about language learning here being this big adventure. Well, some of you sent in some fascinating research about Gestalt language processing. And you know what? It kind of has me rethinking that whole adventure idea.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, it turns out there might not be just one path to fluency, like we always assume, right?
Right.
And that's where I thought you could help us out. Unpack this whole Gestalt language processing thing, or GLP, for all of us.
Of course, happy to. You see, many people just assume that to learn a new language, you have to master all the grammar rules first and then build your vocabulary brick by brick.
Yeah, totally.
But GLP actually suggests that for some learners, it's more about absorbing these big chunks of language, almost like downloading entire scripts. And then they just use those chunks in conversation.
Whoa, hold on. Downloading entire scripts. That sounds almost like too good to be true. So how does that even work?
It is pretty amazing when you really think about it. Think of it like learning a song. You can sing along and enjoy it without ever needing to actually know the musical theory behind it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's the same with language.
Oh, okay. I see. So you're saying someone who's a GLP learner, they might just pick up a phrase like, how's it going? And use it perfectly fine in conversation, even if they don't consciously get all the individual words or the grammar.
Exactly. And that's actually where things start to get really interesting because the dominant model of language acquisition, the one by Stephen Krashen, it doesn't really account for learning like that at all.
And Krashen's model, that's a pretty big deal, right?
Oh yeah, super influential.
Yeah, I remember even learning about it back in school.
Mhm.
So how does GLP, like, challenge that model then?
Well, so Krashen, he focuses on a very step-by-step approach. Learners kind of gradually build up their skills, but GLP is more about these huge leaps, big jumps, these sudden aha moments where a whole chunk of language suddenly clicks.
Oh, interesting. So if someone is like a GLP learner, they might not fit into that linear progression that Krashen talks about.
Exactly. And that can have some pretty serious real-world consequences, especially when we think about things like education and therapy.
Yeah, and that actually brings up a point that's been on my mind ever since you sent over this research,
Yeah.
because it mentions that the author, this PhD expert in GLP, Jaime Hoerricks, it says she actually graduated high school as successful but functionally illiterate
Yeah.
because her learning style was never recognized. And that's a pretty stark example.
It is, and unfortunately, it's not that unique either.
Wow.
Just imagine being told your whole life that you're just not a good language learner, when in reality, you just learn differently.
That's heartbreaking. And it seems like because of this, misunderstanding around GLP, it can even lead to some pretty serious misdiagnoses, right?
Yeah, sadly, it does. Because it's not widely understood. Many learners just end up being mislabeled as having a speech or learning disability when in reality, they just need a different approach.
It's like they're being pushed into a system that isn't made for them,
Exactly.
which, especially with the rise of the whole science of reading movement,
Yeah.
that can be really problematic.
Definitely, because science of reading, and it's well-intentioned, but it really stresses this phonics-based instruction and this very structured approach to literacy, which for some learners is great.
Right.
But for a GLP learner, it can actually be, well, detrimental.
Almost like trying to teach a fish to climb a tree.
Exactly. A total mismatch of learning style.
Yeah, but here's something I thought was super interesting, too. You know how Krashen's work, it became really big in the 70s and 80s.
Hmm.
Well, during that same time period, there was all this research coming out from the Soviet Union. That was looking at language acquisition from a totally different angle.
That's right, yeah.
So were they already talking about GLP back then?
Not in those specific terms, no. But they were already emphasizing how important cultural context is and social interaction. They were talking about the idea that there are multiple pathways to fluency. And this was way back in the 1920s and 30s.
Wow, so there was this whole body of research that just got kind of ignored.
It seems that way, yeah. Makes you wonder how different things might be if those insights had been incorporated into the models we use today.
It really does.
Yeah.
I mean, wow. We've got this whole alternative style of learning that's been largely ignored,
Mhm.
and we might have had clues about it all along,
Mm.
hidden in plain sight. This is why I love these deep dives. They really make you question everything you thought you knew.
Me too. It really is exciting to uncover these hidden threads and then think about how they could change how we view language learning and education in general.
Absolutely. Welcome back, everyone. I don't know about you, but thinking about all those people who might have been, mislabeled or misunderstood because they learned differently, it's really kind of stayed with me.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder. like how many opportunities were missed, not just for them as individuals, but for, society as a whole.
Exactly. Like, what could we have accomplished if we'd been recognizing and nurturing these different ways of learning all along? But okay, before we go too far down that road, let's come back to those real-world consequences we were discussing before.
Right, because this misunderstanding, it doesn't just stop at someone feeling misunderstood.
Yeah.
It can actually lead to interventions that are, well, not only ineffective, but even harmful in some cases.
And the research you sent in, it mentioned this idea that, and I'm quoting here, all children need all therapies. Which, on the surface, it sounds like a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But for a GLP learner, it could actually backfire.
Right, because the thinking there is that GLP is something that needs to be, corrected instead of just seeing it as a natural variation in learning styles.
Oh, I see.
So you get a GLP learner ending up in speech therapy, when what they really need is an environment that supports their way of processing language.
So it's like we're trying to fix something that isn't even broken.
Exactly.
And I imagine that can really do a number on a kid's self-esteem. Being told over and over that the way you speak is wrong, when actually it's perfectly natural for you.
Absolutely. And then this misunderstanding goes even further than just speech therapy.
Right, to those misdiagnoses of learning disabilities that we were talking about.
Exactly.
Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Sure. So because GLP isn't widely recognized, kids who learn this way, they might have a harder time in a traditional classroom.
Yeah.
And so they get misdiagnosed with a specific learning disability, an SLD, when really their challenges might be coming from the environment itself.
So it's not them, it's the system.
Exactly.
So instead of getting instruction that works for them, they're put on a path that might not be the best fit at all.
Exactly. And that can have this ripple effect,
Yeah.
impacting their whole educational journey, how they see themselves, their motivation, how well they do overall.
It really shows how important early identification and intervention is, doesn't it?
It really does.
If we could recognize GLP right from the start, then we could give them the right support and hopefully avoid some of these negative outcomes.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important for educators, therapists, parents, everyone to be aware of GLP and how it shows up.
And speaking of parents, I know the science of reading movement has gotten really big in recent years. So how is that impacting families with GLP kids?
Well, science of reading, it's often presented as the way to teach reading, right? And it emphasizes this very specific approach, often phonics-based, which, again, for some learners, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But for a kid who learns through GLP, it might not be the right fit.
Right, like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And parents, of course, they want the best for their children.
Of course.
So they might feel pressure to do this approach, even if it doesn't match their child's natural learning style.
And it's not that science of reading is bad.
Right.
It's just that it's not like a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. We need more options, more flexibility, more recognition that there are many ways to become literate.
So then what would a more GLP-friendly approach to language instruction look like? The research mentioned the natural language acquisition model, NLA.
Yes, NLA aligns much better with how GLP learners process language. Instead of just memorizing things or focusing on explicit grammar rules, it's about creating these rich, immersive language experiences.
So more hands-on experiential learning, then.
Exactly. Think about how kids naturally learn their first language.
Right.
It's through real-world interactions, through stories, songs, play. NLA tries to mimic that natural process.
So instead of drilling verb conjugation,
Yes.
a teacher might have them do role-playing activities where they're using those verbs in context.
Exactly. Or instead of focusing on individual vocabulary words, they might read a richly illustrated book aloud, so the kids can absorb the new language in a way that actually means something to them.
It sounds like the focus is more on communication
Yeah.
and actually understanding things rather than, perfect grammar.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where they feel safe to experiment with language, to make mistakes, and learn from them without feeling judged.
And that's where it gets really cool, because GLP learners, they often have amazing strengths in other areas.
Oh, absolutely.
The research talked about how they might be really visual learners, or excel at problem solving, or be super empathetic.
That's right. They often have this incredible ability to see the big picture, to connect things and understand things on a deeper level.
So a GLP-informed approach wouldn't just help their language development, it would also help them develop these other talents.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where they feel seen, understood, and valued for who they are.
It sounds like a much more I don't know, holistic and humane way to approach education in general.
I think so too.
But we're just about out of time for this segment. When we come back for part 3, we'll talk more about the bigger implications of understanding GLP and what steps we can all take to create a more inclusive learning environment for everyone. So stay with us.
And welcome back for our final segment on Gestalt language processing. I gotta say, this has been one of the most, eye-opening deep dives we've ever done.
I agree. It really shows you how many assumptions we just have
Mm-hmm.
about how people learn,
Yeah.
especially with language.
It's like we've been looking at it all through this really tiny little window,
Huh.
and GLP is helping us, throw that window wide open.
Exactly. And the more we understand GLP, the more I think we start to realize it's not just about, making space for a certain learning style. It challenges some really fundamental ideas about education in general.
Right. It's almost like we've built this whole system where there's only one right way to learn. And if you don't fit in, well, then somehow you're seen as, deficient. That's so true. And it's not just about, the actual methods that are being used. It's also about how we measure learning. What does success even mean?
Yeah.
If our assessments are only designed for one kind of learner, we're going to miss a whole bunch of people who could be doing amazing things if they were just given the right support.
So true. So how do we start to, shift things? The research mentioned a book called Holistic Language Instruction by Jaime Hoerricks.
Yes, it's a great resource for teachers and therapists who want to learn more about a GLP-informed approach. It has all sorts of practical strategies for creating a more inclusive learning environment.
Oh.
And it really stresses, how important it is to see the strengths that come along with GLP.
Because it's not about getting rid of traditional teaching methods completely, right?
No, not at all.
It's more about having more tools in our toolbox.
Yeah.
And being more adaptable.
Exactly. We can still use phonics, we can still teach grammar, but we have to do it in a way that makes sense for GLP learners.
Right.
Right.
So, for example, instead of teaching grammar rules just by themselves,
Right.
you could incorporate them into activities where they're actually using language naturally.
Exactly. It goes back to creating those immersive, engaging experiences we were talking about,
Yeah.
where they can absorb the language holistically, just like they did when they were little.
And remember how we said GLP learners often excel in areas that those traditional assessments, they don't even look at.
Right.
They might be super visual learners or incredibly creative or have so much empathy.
Yeah, that's so common.
It's not about trying to, catch them up. It's about recognizing and supporting those talents, shifting from a deficit model to an asset model.
Yes, exactly. That's such an important point. When we see GLP as a strength instead of a weakness, it opens up so many more possibilities.
Just imagine a classroom where every single student feels seen and valued for their unique way of learning. Their strengths are celebrated, their differences are seen as assets. That's a future I want to help build.
Me too, absolutely. And it starts with awareness. The more we talk about this, the more we share this knowledge, the closer we get to that vision.
This has been a truly amazing deep dive. We started by questioning our own assumptions about language learning, and now we're reimagining what education could look like if we just embraced a more holistic and inclusive approach.
It has been a journey. And honestly, I think the most exciting part is we're only just getting started. There's still so much more to learn about GLP and how it impacts the way we teach and learn.
That's so true. As we wrap up today, I want to leave you with one final thought. If GLP is as common as the research says it is, why has it been ignored for so long? What does that tell us about our biases and what we think about intelligence and learning? What can we do, both individually and as a community, to create a more equitable and empowering educational landscape for everyone? Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible exploration of Gestalt language processing. And until next time, keep diving deep.